Well, as you can see, the title of the presentation is On the Periphery of Genocide, Roma Community in Lviv, 1941-1944. That is during the Nazi German occupation of town. And I am, as Irina rightly said, Piotr Wawrzeniuk from University, and I teach at the National Defense University in Sweden, which is often mixed with Switzerland, but it's actually far away. Sorry. It's not a landlocked country, right? With me, I have Martynenko. We joined our forces for the project. It seemed very logical to bring in Taras and consult him and discuss with him, of course, since he is a real expert on Lviv during the occupation time. And not only the occupation time, to be exact, but you can basically consult him about everything. Everything about the town's modern history. So now to our propositions. That is hypothesis that for the first, Roma lived in Lviv throughout the Nazi occupation. So there was a Roma presence from 1941 and to 1944 to very weeks preceding the arrival of the Soviet army. Another finding is that citizenship did not matter as much as expected. That is, being from former Poland, that is Generalgouvernement, was not, say, automatically legal for you or meant intensified persecution, but on the other hand, being Romanian or Hungarian citizen could actually help you with, say, rationing coupons and food, etc. Then we've found relatively milder policy towards Roma in Lviv as such. I can say very little about district Galicia and the surrounding region, but here in town we can definitely note a milder policy towards Roma than, say, in other urban centers of the Generalgouvernement. That is, whatever was left of former Poland that was not directly annexed into the German Reich. And then we will also discuss at the end the Jewish model of persecution. That is, how the ways in which Roma were persecuted, whether one can apply a Jewish model of persecution, something that is very often used which appears in the interviews of Roma survivors, but also in historiography. So I say something general about Nazi persecution of Roma. I'll be very general because we don't have much time, so we can go for the goodies. I mean, for our findings, to the empirical work. So this is how I'm summing up. So in Germany, as such, there was a long tradition of persecution of Roma. There were laws and regulations going back to the 19th century, several of them back to 18th century. And there was registration of Roma rather early, restrictions and so on. And this policy continued after Kaiser Germany, so it continued for the Weimar Republic. And was, of course, used by the Nazis once they came to power. But they added this racial perspective. So they were not longer only viewed as antisocial and potential threat, criminal threat to society, but also as racially impure, most of them at least. Because there was a Institute of Racial Hygiene headed by one Dr. Ritter, performing a lot of pseudoscience, claiming that there was only a tiny amount of pure Roma and Sinti in Germany, while the rest of them were Mischlinge, that is of mixed race, and they should somehow be got away with, whether sterilization or displacement, so they finally were either sterilized or sent to concentration camps or deported to the Generalgouvernement. Now, if one, I've told you about the Reich, right? And there have been debates about, in the research, about whether, to begin with, as Irina said, there is not much research on persecution of Roma here in the region during the Second World War. While one can say that studies of the Holocaust, of the genocide of Jews, started basically in parallel with the persecution. You had Emanuel Ringenblum in Warsaw, building an archive and trying to understand and making notes. There was Philip Friedman hiding here in Lviv, also trying to gather data and trying to conceptualize what was going on. So you have this long tradition of research, while say broader research on Roma genocide took off only in the 90s, one can say. Since then, there has been debate whether it has been actually a genocide or whether it was a genocide or not. Where, according to UN definition, it definitely was to liquidate in whole or in part, particular part of particular ethnic group or nationality. But this has been on this debate, and people who usually claim that there was no genocide, they point at the lack of clear orders, lack of general order, let's say, encompassing all Roma, lack of regularity, varying policies in various parts of Europe, etc. While those who claim there was genocide, they usually say that there was an intent, right? There was an intent to destroy this group sooner or later. For some reasons, it did not happen in certain regions thoroughly. If you look around, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, an estimate is that half of Roma died in those countries. They perished during the genocide, which is less percentage of the Jews than the Jews, right? But there was still an intent, they say, to annihilate this group. But somehow the persecution stalled, and it was not pursued to the end of the war. Now some words about Roma persecution in Generalgouvernement. This administrative unity entirely made of whatever was left of Poland. In 1941, in August, District Galician was added after Operation Barbarossa took off in June. And here, Roma persecution peaked in 1942-1943. So Roma survivors recall that something happened. There was a radicalization of measures in 1942. And the killings peaked in 1943, according to Michael Zimmerman, at least. And many Roma were put in ghettos, in death camps, in concentration camps. There was this practice with the ghettos in, let's say, Warsaw for sure, Siedlce in district Warsaw, then in district Radom, and several smaller ghettos. And this was the practice also in several towns in Reichskommissariat Ukraine, the neighboring administrative unit to the east and to the north of District Galicia, and to the east of Generalgouvernement. However, although over 20,000 Germans in Roma were killed in Auschwitz-Birkenau, there was a number of Warsaw, Polish Roma who were gathered in Warsaw Ghetto, who were sent to Treblinka, who were Austrian Roma in Litzmannstadt, which was not general government. They were all taken to death camps and gassed. Most of Roma in general government, they died by shooting. They were shot. So usually they were shot where they were found, that is in the countryside, in the forests, if encountered, but also sedentary Roma, they were also persecuted. So, because there was also this debate, I should have told you, that actually the Nazis, they only persecuted the nomadic Roma. But they persecuted, in general government, they for sure persecuted Roma who'd been sedentary at least since mid of 19th century, the Carpathian Roma. Particularly, I mean, of course, in Carpathians, in the district of Krakow, this persecution was very heavy. And in general government, Jews and Roma were supposed to have ID cards with yellow color, so there is a similarity here. But there were two categories that stood out when it comes to regulations and decrees. That's Germans, they are singled out, Germans, and Jews. While this status of Roma was never specified. So they somehow remained in an unknown sphere of so-called non-German peoples. Although they, according to racial laws made early in Germany in 1935 and 1936, German Sinti and Roma, they lost their citizenship. And also, when it comes to general government, Jews and Roma were exempted from being Fremdvölkische, meaning non-German peoples under German protection. So they, in theory, they did not have this protection. District Galicia, of which Lviv was capital, for almost 3 years. Something about the policy here. The shootings started in 1942, in the spring. The research mentions Rawa Ruska and Holodok, Rubachev, now in Poland, but in the district of Rawa Ruska. Perhaps in Sambir, shooting when ghetto was being liquidated. But I've also found cases in Kamianka Bushka, I mean Kamionka Strumilowa, in the files of interrogations of former police officers who were stationed in Rawa Ruska. So there certainly were more victims than one can make higher estimates, because there were more shootings than the documents suggest. There also probably were deportations from Stanisławiv, that is Ivano-Frankivsk, to Belzec of a group of Roma, and supposedly a group of Roma from Boryslav region was sent to forced labor camp. But that's not for sure. The sources of this information, they are unclear, so we cannot really tell with full certainty. As to Roma, there was a regulation that applied to all non-Germans, that they had to report and register at local authorities if traveling. So they could be stopped on the ground if they were moving around in the countryside without permission, without registering. There was also special clause about, particularly about people who traveled in gypsy way and vagabonds. And there was a registering of foreign Roma in the district of Galicia in the spring of 1942, because local authorities, they actually started to, there was this a decision to register all foreigners. So this was part of this this campaign, registering all foreigners and removing them, deporting them if possible. So they were to be deported, but reportedly many of them remained, not least here in Lviv. So I suppose not of them were deported, or deportation didn't take place, but the police certainly, German police, they took measures to make sure that their life was miserable. So they were encouraging, in documents very gleeful formulation, they were encouraging them to leave. And among many things and many documents I've worked through, I also listened to Roma survivors' interviews collected by Shoah Foundation. They are available in Warsaw, many other places, but for me Warsaw is most handy to reach from Stockholm. And among things most crucial for survival, for their survival here, we mentioned identity concealment, meaning they would dress in, as they say, Polish or Ukrainian way, or they were arranging with Romanian or Hungarian documents in order to evade arrest or execution, because they claimed that Polish documents, being Polish Roma, was basically a death sentence. Linguistic skills counted. I mean, knowing German and being able to explain that you were a gypsy but not a Jew was also important, according to several informants. And then, of course, hiding. They recall Roma survivors were hiding in Lviv, in flats left by Jews in rather miserable conditions. Some of them claimed that they were in the ghetto with barbed wire and watchtowers. We will discuss that later. And you see this in their statements. There is this. It follows the description of persecution follows the Jewish model, so to say, what we chose to call the Jewish model of persecution. That is ghettoization, where we put into ghetto restrictions of movement. There were being, we were not allowed to leave the territory, and or they would be severely punished, that is, executed. They were made to perform forced labor, and they were persecuted on ethnic grounds. That's what they, if we sum up, say the sum of this recollection. And now Taras will discuss this Jewish model of persecution and whether and to which extent it applied to Roma. And we have studied the situation in Lviv only, basically, because that's here we have available documents left by the criminal police, Ukrainian police, the headquarters of the police, and by the courts, German Special Court, and the Town Court and the County Court of Lviv.
Доброго вечора.
Good evening. Before we get down to the discussion of whether and to which extent we could apply the Jewish model of persecution in the reconstruction of the Roma case in Lviv, I would like to tell a couple of words about the Roma community attributes. Upon the whole, the Roma have been present in Lviv since the early 15th century, and they have been there has been an ongoing presence. Usually they were residing in the northern part of the city, which is the southern slopes of the High Castle Mountain. It traditionally has been resided by Roma since the mid-18th century. With time, they were shifting and moving to the north as the city expanded, and in the beginning of the 20th century and by the middle of the 20th century, the Nowa Znesinja neighborhood was considered to be traditionally the Roma neighborhood, Cyganivka and the northern areas of Kleparew district, and also up north to the area of the Zbojiszcza village. And it actually has had quite a strong Roma community for many centuries. Their major activities included the traditional crafts like smith work and production of the so-called wire works. Roma were traveling along villages and helped them with different craft work. And it also explains the fact that they were rather concentrated not in the urban type neighborhoods. Usually, these neighborhoods are actually resembling the rural type of life even these days. They used to live in the houses, and also they had the traditional concentration camping sites. In Lviv, it was in the Adamova Street. Excuse me for this irregularity. This red spot here, it is presently the area of the Almaz Instrument plant. This camp also existed during the Nazi occupation, at least until 1943. We also managed to localize another side of camping during the Second World War here around the Stokova Street. These sites are traditionally there because Roma used to choose the camping sites in the rangelands where they herded the cattle around Kleparew area and in the open areas. This is the so-called Boiska neighborhood. If we talk, well, actually, how could we define the Roma community? They were not a homogeneous entity, what could be described in terms of the Jewish community with any authority that could represent the interests of the Jewish community to the national authorities. In case of Roma community, this is some sort of the conglomerate of different camps and different communities, and they have the clan system, and the camps could include from 10 persons to 1,000 persons, and each of them had their own elders, the so-called Roma elders or gypsy elders, who were the informal mediators between the Roma and local population and local authorities. This pattern has also been preserved during the war. The German or the Nazi authorities have not introduced any new patterns like they did in case of the Ukrainians, Polish and Jews. They had these rescue committees and the Judenrat for Jews. The Roma pattern actually remained the same, acting via the moderation of the Roma elders. Talking about the narrative tradition, the Roma testimonies and interviews often mentioned the forced displacement, deportation to the ghetto area already in 1941, with the start of the Nazi occupation, in fact. But could this be treated as the deportation or displacement as such? We can see the traditional places of residence for Roma in the yellow color here on this map. This is originally the area of the Jewish community, of the Jewish neighborhood, established in autumn 1941. Theoretically, all of the Lviv Jews were supposed to be displaced here, and here you can see part of the area of the so-called open ghetto with no displacement, but it was liquidated in autumn 1942. The area of the Jewish neighborhood actually coincided with the area of their traditional residence, and it must be mentioned that many local residents, not only Roma people, but Polish and Ukrainian people, stayed to live there within this neighborhood. They were not displaced as commanded by the regulations from the authorities. But after the special regulations and orders in autumn 1942, they abandoned these areas of the closed ghetto. Here you can see them in the orange color on this map. This part was surrounded with a wooden fence, and you could not leave this area. But the previous neighborhood was an open area. And there was the dedicated area for Jews, and the history of this area ended in the early June 1941. You had this Judenlager as the forced labor camp with the barracks. And in June 1943 it was liquidated. Where could the Roma people be located in the entire story? We managed to record the localized sites of residence with these blue spots on the map. They coincide with the traditional places and neighborhoods of residence of the Roma. And some of them, several of them, overlap with the closed ghetto area, but all of them date back to the period post-deportation of Jews. And this is why my colleague mentioned that many Roma witnessed and they claimed they were hiding in the apartments abandoned by the Jews. So we failed to find any evidence, either in the letters on the displacement or other documents about the Roma as part of the community that shall be concentrated somewhere. Tadeusz Sederecki is the author who mentions some plans of the German authority to concentrate and settle the Roma community on some dedicated streets. In the Balanova Street, presently Hajdamacka Street, and the Kotlarska Street area, which is the area of the former open ghetto. He also claims, but we do not have evidence on implementation of these plans. Another aspect of the Jewish model of persecution is the restrictions of movement. In case of Jews, these restrictions were imposed from the very first weeks of the occupation in the early July. They were enforced to have the bands on their sleeves. They had restrictions for movement around the city, like 2 hours before. Well, so there was the discrimination for the restricted time or nighttime, or attending the market areas, and they needed to have a special permit to move around the city, unless it was the way to work. So the only way to leave the ghetto was in organized groups or brigades to the place of work. Also, the Jews were forbidden to use the public transport or to live out of the city or to leave their job places or to use the trains. Were there any restrictions like that for Roma community? We couldn't claim for sure. As we can see, there are some recorded places or sites of arrest. In the criminal cases, they are scattered all around the city, and the same as the stories described in the interviews, they imply that most of the Roma people were Roma women who were wandering around the city areas to tell the fortune. They also were wandering around the German neighborhoods like Heroi Maidana and Vitovsko Street, even though the security measures were reinforced them, they still were wandering around these areas, also even wearing the Roma traditional clothing. So there are also some recorded cases of arrest of the Roma women in the central part of the city, like in Krakowska Street, which goes against the traditional narrative sources. Also, there are some cases of the lawful use of the tram and trains by the Roma people, along with Ukrainians and Polish people. In addition to the restrictions of movement, the same as for the Jews, another aspect of this typical Jewish model of persecution was the forced labor. The interviews and the testimonies would often mention hard work of men, especially at factories or plants, and it probably makes us draw some parallels to the Jewish model of persecution as well. You can notice here that in the district of Galicia area, there was the mandatory regulation for mandatory labor. All of the men from 18 to 65 had to do forced labor if they didn't have any special ID cards. They could go to the forced labor to the area of Reich, or to go to the filtering camp in the Janjew concentration camp, or to several months of the forced labor in the concentration camp if it was the repeated arrest. But it pertained to everyone except for the German citizens. Equally to Ukrainians, Poles, and Roma people. The cases with Roma people are not unique as compared to Ukrainians or Poles. Also, there are many records of employing Roma for different private companies, even working for the Germans, such as in the railway station. There was a large group of Roma people with Romanian citizenship, but they were working on the legal basis. At the same time, women, well, according to the law, they did not have to mandatory work. They could keep the household, but they were wandering around, telling the fortune to people, trying to find the food. And the last attribute, which is referred to in terms of the Jewish model of persecution, is the persecution on ethnic grounds, which is probably by far the most important attribute. Within this occupation system, a human being was guilty merely because of being of Jewish origin, and it can be vividly seen in the files of the criminal cases, and they do reflect the dynamics of treating this or that ethnic group. You could trace the changes of the attitudes throughout the period of 1941 to 1943, because the cases could be kept for a long time, so you could see the changes of the policy as reflected in these files of the criminal cases. Whether Roma were persecuted in the same way, or was there any difference in treating the Roma community as compared to Ukrainians and Polish people by the authorities and law enforcement bodies? Usually the investigation period for Roma cases were quite short. After they were arrested and beaten, they were putting down the evidence. According to the law, the Roma person was not even the subject of the legal process. You could only record that he admitted himself to be a Jew, and that was enough. After 1943, the legal ground for arrest was the unlawful stay beyond the Jewish ghetto. You could even find these statements in 1944. There was no Jewish neighborhood any longer, but still this regulation was applied. None of the cases against Jews were finalized. They usually were transferred to the Jewish law enforcement authorities. They were sent to the forced labor camps and perished. So they could not be found any longer, or they were dead by that time. In case of Roma, we can see the entire finalized legal process in place, such as this is the right to refuse from their evidence if they were received with the use of force. So they could actually refuse from their evidence in the court, and the court could justify them on these grounds. They also had the right to use a lawyer if it was a minor person. The Polish guardianship committee could take charge of this Roma child, the same as for Polish people. But it was not possible in case of Roma. If it was the small boy, it was just taken away and no investigation procedures were taking place. In almost half of all of the cases, the Roma convicts were justified and let out, which means that the investigation was taking place. And when the local population was witnessing against them, then they would be charged and sentenced. Otherwise, they would be let out. So the investigator could note down that the evidence is based on stereotype, that all of the gypsies are the same, etc. But there is no factual evidence. And these statements are also available. So the court procedures would be similar and closer to the cases against Ukrainians and Poles, even the Germans, rather than the cases against the Jews. As to the ethnic grounds, this ethnic factor was not legally important in these proceedings. They would rather use the peculiar type of activity or something else. Since the end of the 19th century, there was a separate type of profession, a gypsy. So, like the job or type of activities would record a gypsy. But there were no cases recorded when this factor had an effect on the court decision.
So over to the conclusions. For first, Lviv was a relatively safe place for Roma refugees, and they were refugees, many of them. Some were local, but many came from other parts, other districts of the general governments. Particularly, we see a lot of people coming from the district of Krakow, where there was very intense persecution in 1942 and 1943. But here we haven't found any documents about actual about executions or more active measures of persecution. There is one instance, the police register, they were registering Roma, Erfassung von Zigeuner, and that's January 1943. But then they continued to appear in court cases throughout 43 and 44, as long as German occupation lasts. Then it was ghetto coming to Roma. They were not brought to ghetto. That's also a conclusion we can see from the documents and from the history of Roma settlement in Lviv. And absence of systematic persecution on ethnic grounds, at least here in the town of Lviv. Because most, let's say, there are strong indications that the policy looked different in the countryside, and particularly so in other districts of the general government. So those results are valid for Lviv only. And then there is a citation of made by Serhiy Plokhy. I was visiting a seminar in Sweden, and he came to the seminar, and he tried to provoke the seminarists who was presenting. Actually, it was a manuscript, PhD manuscript. Okay, you have this, and this is very interesting. So what? That's the question. That's actually a very good question. So what? What do we do with that? What can we say? How does this add to the history of persecution of Roma during the Second World War? For first, it supports the picture of very varying approaches towards Roma. The policies varied depending on the needs of the local administration and their understanding on how the policies should be shaped. Because usually the lack of regulations and this varying policy has been interpreted as actually worsening the situation, making it more radical, opening for various dramatic lethal measures from the side of local authorities, police forces, gendarmerie, etc. It also points at the need of, it points at the need of further research on how the situation looked in towns, in other towns. In general government, there is nothing on Roma, basically nothing in Ivano-Frankivsk, and there are 2 documents in Ternopil, but actually suggest that some of them lived in the countryside in 1942, and that some of them traveled by train all the way to Ternopil and the neighboring villages, and they were looking for food and trying to make some money. And that's it. They are out of history. So something comparative would be very interesting to undertake in the future. Thank you for your attention, and I suppose there is room for questions. И можно задавати питання українською.
And you could ask questions in Ukrainian. I can understand some Ukrainian, but I couldn't be bold enough to lecture in Ukrainian because I like this terminology. Thank you so much. I just want to ask you, do we need to translate into English, to interpret into English? Anyone listening? Just for recording, all right. Дякуємо за перше запитання. So we will use the microphone all the time. We need this for recording. You must have mentioned, but I didn't notice, how many Roma were recorded in Lviv. I think if we count all of the Roma people recorded in these court and police cases, if we count all of the Roma elders and witnesses and the community, or at least two people could be called a community, so I think roughly the over 160 persons, at least 160 persons recorded in these materials. We do not know about the exact numbers of Roma availability in the city. There is the statistics from 1942, but the Roma were included into the category of the others. They were neither Ukrainians nor Poles or Jews, but they were others. And then in the Soviet times there were like Russians, the Soviets, and the Gypsies. But if the 160 persons were recorded in the cases, the community must have been several times larger. So I believe over 1,000 persons. But there were no other recordings. The major criteria were the linguistic and religious affiliation. The Poles were not included. They're not included in the pre-war census records we would have presented. How did you manage to trace them, to locate them in these long lists? We were using the names. Roma, actually, we were using the name factor. Usually Roma tend to take the last names of the people they live among. Since these are nomadic people, so in Warsaw it was Glowacki, a typical name, or Brzezinski. In Lviv it could imply it is a Roma person. But it would make no sense to be looking for Glowacki, Brzezinski, or Paczkowski, because there will be many of them. In German courts there will be dozens of them. There were specific last names like Korbat, Lakatosh, very peculiar for the large clans and communities, Hankel, and they were easy to locate. A big part of the Polish Roma community, they have Polish names, very typical Polish, common Polish names, Kwiatkowski, Brzezinski, Zieliński. So it's very difficult to locate them in the documents. You need to really analyze all of the Kwiatkowski or Zieliński. This is the second most popular name. We even had Kowalski, a typical Polish name. Usually you take the case, we were trying to get the database, the corpus. In one criminal case there will be witnesses, the relatives, the parents, and after some time we could understand the situation for some area, for the typical names for the specific period of time. Later you could see it easier, and it's easier to find if you have typical criminal cases and charges. Usually this was about theft and robbery, either of the options, or a lack of registration. So if we could see the typical criminal charges for the specific person, it could be located this way. I have a question about the role of the government. There is this famous statement of the historian Snyder, who claims that many people in times of the German or Nazi occupation were killed because they didn't have any protection from the government. They implied the Jews. He would reiterate this statement very often. So you could not be underestimating the role of the state, because this could be the important protective factor, for example, for the Jews against being killed. Could your study support this proposition about the state as a protective factor? In a way, the Polish government meant the Polish state managed to protect them. There were no anti-Roma laws. They didn't really make them register, and the Germans were really irritated at that. There was one person in 1944 that were trying to find any of the documents regulating this issue, so they could not really locate the Roma. So this is the legacy of the Polish state. No census were showing them specifically. If you take a look on the contemporary newspapers of those times, you could not find any evidence that they treated Roma community as a special category on the ethnic or national grounds. Instead, to some extent, this was the continuation of the Polish state, because many Roma people actually are mentioned in the acts of the city court and the county court that operate under Polish laws, except for the cases when some activities were regulated by the Governorate General legislation. When these cases were taken to the German special court, when they were considered to harm the German state, then the Polish laws were not applied. So that's true. There might be some aspect like this. As to Jews, it's more probably evident, but the Germans are working on that. They were taking away their rights and eliminating their rights and their private space, claiming their rights. Snyder actually does not consider for Roma in his book, as far as I remember. Well, he tries to generalize, in general terms, like the state, in case of extermination of some ethnic group, could act as a protective factor. So in such a case, I could answer very briefly to that question, no. Thank you for this presentation. It is very interesting indeed. You mentioned that Roma people, the respondents or some of the written interviews that you worked with in Warsaw, they would be guided by a certain narrative framework, or at least they have some sample for their stories, and there will be this Jewish model of persecution. Is that true? These people have acquired certain experience after the war, and they have acquired this ability. They have become capable to tell their stories according to certain model. So I'm really interested to know, where have they gotten this model from? Maybe through media or through other sources and channels. They have acquired this knowledge about the forms of persecution during the war, and they are sort of reproducing it, but it makes sense because during the Soviet times this topic was not so widespread, and it is not popular in the Ukrainian media either, even today. So maybe you could share, you could tell us, where could these people get this framework to share their experience? The interviews I analyzed were recorded in 1997, in 1998, which is 54 years after the end of the war, of the German occupation in Lviv and in Galicia as such. I believe that with time, this persecution picture and perception has included the Roma memories and narratives as well. Maybe some of their relatives had a very different experience, some violent experience in the other parts of the Governorate General. I believe it was overlapping this way, these stories and this experience were overlapping somehow. And we should also mention that mostly these were the people who reconstructed the stories from their parents. So they were too young, like under 10 years of age. Most of them were born in the 1930s or in the late 30s, and they would often really filter out these stories through the memories of their parents, like their mother. Thank you. It is indeed very interesting, but I also believe that this is a good subject for further study, because as far as I know, there is some peculiarity of the Roma community, their communication patterns, their literacy level, their education levels. Did they get access to the public media that was broadcasting this general perception? Today, this dominating narrative about the Holocaust as the brightest example of the genocide is really disseminated in various ways. So this discourse is spreading and disseminating, and maybe the Roma community could have a special experience in absorbing this experience. Some of the researchers actually mentioned this as part of the nation-forming factor, and obviously that would pertain to all ethnic groups. You mentioned that there is no data available for other cities and there is nothing to compare with to take a broader picture. Is there any research available for other areas under German occupation in other countries? Some studies or research works you could refer to place Lviv into a broader context to understand whether this is the exception or not, and whether it requires further study. There are documents because Roma are present in the court papers of Lublin, of Krakow, of Warsaw. But I have not had a chance to take a closer look on these documents. Mostly they are not available. We have few of the papers for 1943 and 44. At least this is my impression working with these documents. On the other hand, Michael Zimmermann studied this issue from Reichskommissariat Ukraine, and there is a well-known study on that topic, and we could say that Lviv was really distinct and peculiar, and the district Galicia was peculiar and different in that respect. Some of the documents from police and law enforcement bodies are available, and also these testimonies of the police officers from Ravaruska, from Battalion 133. They claim and they imply that they must have killed many more Roma people than the documents state. There are only several documents preserved, but their memory records many more of the killed Roma people. And you can trace the practices of the Jewish commissariat. Whenever they came across a Roma person, they were shooting them down. And they were asking them, why are you shooting us? They couldn't understand their treatment. The police did have the practices like this, and they claim they actually did not have this practice as official. There was this order of the General Beckett, and it was in August 1942, And this order claimed that you should not be killing Roma because of ethnic grounds, but since they are bandits and they are helping the underground soldiers, so you could treat them as criminals as such, not because they are Roma. So this is his interpretation of the Himmler order. So they did have some practices like this. So this district, Galicia, the situation in the district is very similar to other parts of the governorship. Also in the district of Colomea, there were some records of the Roma people. There are fewer of them between 1942 and 1943. In 1943, there were only 77 Roma people recorded, while in 1942, there were about 250 of them. But this is also about the border proximity. There were different channels. The so-called green border, Romania is very close, and the Reichskommissariat. What happened to them? We have no idea. They could escape, but we could assume many things. Also, there are no documents in Ivano-Frankivsk claims that they must have been deported or displaced. They are not available at all. It's about the Colomea area. There are some documents of these 77%, but nothing about Stanislavov. So I believe that Lviv was an exception of a kind, and I will try to understand the causes. And to conclude, do you continue this project? Are you going to publish the results of this study? So what's next? So what? Next, I would need to compare to the situation with other districts, and I believe there are fewer of these court materials, but we also need to take a look on the interwar period to analyze the longer term context in line with this trend in the studies of the genocide studies. People started opening their eyes and looking around and trying to get a broader context of what has happened before in the interwar period, to try to compare the experience of the First World War. It would be useful to compare to when I got down to the Warsaw materials, how the national police during the interwar period treated Roma people. Did they have any specific practices treating the Roma people? Did they have any domestic regulations? There are very few of them. Roma is not a big part of the police work. You could understand this from the police materials. They didn't really give much thought to them. Not even a big part of this traditional crime of the horse stealing. Like in the Lublin voivodeship, 90% of these crimes would be committed by Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews, even more than 90%. And there are some individual cases with the Roma recorded. Roma actually engaged and worked together with the local population. And it would be really promising to analyze the situation before that period. I believe the Polish police did not have these practices. They were writing and then stating this. Well, unfortunately, we do not have the situation like in Germany or in Czechoslovakia, because everyone is registered and everyone knows about everyone, and they were complaining about that. So they really didn't have any orderly procedures like that. This was for the police officers to compare about the practices of other police departments in other countries. So, thank you for this presentation. Is there another question? Well, talking about this longue durée, I'm interested to ask maybe the sources that you were using, like these interviews or some other sources. do they include the ideas or interpretation of the people themselves about the different attitude to Roma from Ukrainians and Polish people as compared to the treatment of Jews? Was it really related to the traditional attitudes of the local population, not due to the national policy? I mean, about hiding these people. Do people interpret these different roles as perceived by Ukrainians and Poles? How did they treat the Roma and the Jews? Was this treatment different in general? I don't think I can say anything specific about Lviv in that respect. There are some individual cases we can assume from the interviews when the Roma lady mentions that some Ukrainian-speaking lady gave some potatoes to her. She must have been Polish, but maybe she spoke Ukrainian not to be killed. So this is the stereotype that all of the Ukrainians are evil. But it was the testimony from the rural areas in Galicia, not about Lviv. But they don't remember or they don't know specifically about the locations, because very often it would be about the Volyn areas. So Roma would not really think positive about Ukrainians in this area. It was the partisan war against the Germans, and everyone against everyone. Roma would largely suffer. They believed Roma to be the prospective members of the Soviet underground that was hostile to Polish and Ukrainian underground fighters. So they would often kill them for preventive reasons. But actually these are the conditions of the partisan war. So anyone could kill them, not because of the ethnic grounds. The situation is so much complicated about that. You're trying to compare these models of persecution of the Jews against the Jews and against the Roma people. One of the attributes of discrimination against the Jews was anti-Semitic manifestations in the Nazi propaganda. Was there anything similar against Roma? Did Nazi propaganda include any discrimination? It was rather weak here in this area. The propaganda was much stronger in Warsaw, for example. The Polish newspapers would always draw parallels to Jews and to Roma, very often at least. Not always, but at least often. The Gypsies were included into this category, like they are the source of disease, dirt, and etc. They were believed to be antisocial and racially inferior. However, here in Lviv, the anti-Roma propaganda is quite shallow. Lemberger Zeitung, the newspaper for local Germans in the district of Galicia, as they say in the Polish language, they were writing the problem shall be settled and the Roma shall be treated the same as Jews. It was in 1943. All of the Germans realized that, what this euphemism would mean. So it was stronger in the Polish newspapers, but in Lviv it was much weaker. And the district of Galicia, like in the smaller newspapers, like in Czortkowski Wisti, it could be traced until the spring of 1944. All of the records in the newspapers that are available, they are not different from what was published before the war, in the interwar period. This is a continuous history. It didn't have any manifest propaganda flavor, in particularly in that period. The arrival of big groups of Roma was considered to be like a disaster, like they're wandering around, and how should we tolerate this? It was a typical record in 1941, for example, in Gazeta Lwowska. I'm not sure we could trace any of the Nazi impacts in such messages, in such articles. In a long article, some editorial about the role, about the Jews, they only mention something against the Roma people within the Reichskommissariat area, like in Donbasski Vestnik, Novaya Ukraina in Poltava, and they had large and long reads about the role of Roma, and they were explaining why Roma could not be seen as part of the new future of these areas. Here, we didn't find any records like that.
Дякуємо ще раз за
Thank you for your presentation.
Бажаю вам дальшого